Muito obrigado pela sua participação, pela sua boa vontade de contribuir com o nosso programa. E fique à vontade para apresentar a sua apresentação.
Ok.
Obrigado, Roger.
Welcome. I can start after the computer work. Okay, good afternoon. Welcome again. Thank you for coming to listen me a little bit about shallow lakes and invasions. I will try to expose to you something we are doing in our lab. As you see, all the professors here have problems with the computer. Too much technology for us. So I hope you enjoyed the field station. I think have you been there already? Yeah? Okay. So I hope you also enjoyed the trip to Iguaçu Falls. And I think we are trying to do some studies related to conservation of this ecosystem, not directly related to the conservation, but in some way we can generate or produce results that are able to generate some ways to help the conservation of this kind of aquatic environments in Brazil. So I will try to show you some examples of our studies, most related to shallow lakes, like regime shifts and herbivory, the relationship of these kinds of studies, fish migration and regime shifts in shallow lakes, something about the global variation of species diversity, and also related to invasion biology, some invasion macrophytes and the relationship of these invasive macrophytes with global change aspects, like acidification of aquatic environments, global warming, and eutrophication. Also, we are trying to develop an multimetric index to evaluate the aquatic integrity of those ecosystems you saw in the Paraná River. And I will try to discuss a little bit about this with you. First of all, shallow lakes are important ecosystems, aquatic ecosystems, because they are, I think they are, how can I say, numerous around the world. You can see many shallow lakes in all the continents. Of course, it's not common in Antarctica because it's frozen, but maybe they are there. With global warming, we can see in the future maybe condition. And so here you can see the turbid water state, and with many kinds of mechanisms, diverse mechanisms, we can change. But shallow lakes have a regime shift. It's a dynamic of this kind of ecosystem. These ecosystems usually shift between a turbid aquatic, the aquatic ecosystem from a turbid water to a clear water state. So it's a common regime shifts in shallow lakes around the world. In this first condition, shallow lakes usually have high turbidity, high chlorophyll concentration, high nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus mainly, and low densities of submerged macrophytes. On the other hand, if you go to clear water state, you can see that water turbidity is really low. Low turbidity, low chlorophyll concentration, low nutrients, so we can have light enough to submerged macrophytes grow and dominate this kind of ecosystem. So here you can see that macrophytes are dominating the ecosystem. So these two conditions are the main conditions that characterize this kind of dynamics in shallow lakes. So this is the main field I start to work once I came to the university. So, related to the shifts, we have many mechanisms. One of the mechanisms are related to trophic cascades. And here we have an example of relationships in trophic cascades related to clear water states with macrophyte dominance. And here, in the right side, we have the trophic cascade related to turbid water condition. So the structure seems similar, but the strength of the interactions are really different. What we can see here is that for decades, the classical trophic cascade in the pelagic zone was told as the main interaction or the most important mechanism that drive the regime shifts between turbid and clear water states. But what we can see also is that here, in the right side, we have another trophic cascade that is related to the benthic food chain. So here we can see that we have bentivorous fish, herbivorous fish, mollusks, snails, and the submerged macrophytes and the epiphytes that is attached to the macrophytes. So this side of the trophic cascade was left a little bit, how can I say, the research do not forget this, but do not give the attention, the necessary attention to this, most of them. So the classic view is that, and we are trying to work with this side. The first evidence we get about this relationship in trophic cascade, in benthic trophic cascade, is that snails could be more important or have a stronger indirect positive effect on the submerged growth than the zooplankton have controlling the phytoplankton. So usually zooplankton control the phytoplankton, produce conditions of water transparency that promote macrophyte growth, and also we have epiphytes on the macrophytes. And with snails eating these epiphytes, also we have a decline of the competition between epiphytes and submerged macrophytes, and submerged macrophytes can grow. So we analyze this in an experiment with a control treatment, phytoplankton, epiphytes, submerged macrophytes, zooplankton, and snails. In the control, we don't have the herbivores, only the submerged macrophyte and phytoplankton and periphyton. Here we have only the snails as herbivore, here only the zooplankton, and here both. So we tried to simulate the trophic cascade, the pelagic trophic cascade, and also the benthic trophic cascade. We can see here with these attributes of macrophytes that the length of macrophyte is similar in the presence of herbivores, but other attributes like biomass or number of sprouts per fragments or roots in the macrophytes, these attributes are higher when snails are present. So maybe the benthic trophic cascade is most important than the pelagic trophic cascade to submerged macrophytes in some cases. We can see also that the effect size that we get with all these results is higher when the snail is present than only zooplankton. And also when we put both together, then we have a reduction here, but it's mostly the effect of zooplankton that's lower than the snail, so we have this absence of significance here. Then we can see that benthic food chain may maintain the clear water states and also can be effective as the zooplankton. So for decades we forgot this. Another mechanism related to these shifts are, for example, the benthic activity. So most benthic species, fish benthic species, eat on the bottom and remove plants, submerged plants, detached from the sediment, and also cause turbidity because sediment resuspend, and so we get the turbid state. In our floodplain, we have fish migration, asynchrony with fish migration and also the flood pulse. So the flood pulse comes, water comes higher, and then fish migrate upstream and reach the lakes. Small lakes, shallow ones, receive many fish migrating, and then we have turbid states due to this activity of benthic fish eating on the bottom and detaching submerged macrophyte. So we can see that there is a synchrony here, and all the time there is a synchrony between the flood and fish migration. We have a turbid state. Look at these bars are representing the turbid states when we have the synchrony between the floods and the fish migration. When we don't have flood enough, fish also don't migrate as should be, and then we have a transient state, not turbid, but not so clear, and we don't have dominance of macrophytes. And if this period is long enough, and fish live and macrophyte can colonize, then we have the clear water state with dominance of submerged macrophytes. So it is really important that this synchrony should be kept, because if this synchrony does not occur, the dynamic change and all the species also are different along the time. So as Professor Claudia said, the idea is try to keep the ecosystem as natural as possible. So here we can see the first state, when fish migrate, connectivity increase, and here no fish migration, low connectivity, and the dominance of freshwater submerged macrophytes. So it's another kind of mechanism that is not found in other places. What we can see is that the trophic cascade is the main mechanism, the pelagic one, and also that these shifts may occur with the activity of benthic fish, but not with migration. So it is the first record of fish migration affecting the dynamic of shallow lakes related to regime shifts. Another point that we are trying to study is also another scale also, is at larger scale, like global ones, that, for example, macrophytes can respond to these changes, environmental changes, not only related to temporal scale, but spatial scale. So here we can see that species composition of macrophytes around the world is different from region to region. But why, we don't know. But when we analyze the difference, we can correlate these changes of species with change in environmental condition, like that I'm showing you related to regime shifts. So if you have many shallow lakes in an area, some of them with turbid states, some of them with clear water states. So we have two kinds of natural conditions. And those different conditions support different species composition. So if you conserve an area with many shallow lakes that are able to shift between these two states, then we can conserve more species. And this can help us to understand why species composition, for example, in considering macrophytes, are so different around the world. And we also can see that this environmental heterogeneity could be most important than we usually saw in ecology. That is the effect of latitude on the species diversity. So for terrestrial species, we usually see a pattern that there is an increase of species richness and beta diversity from the poles to the equator. But here with macrophyte, it doesn't matter. What matters is the environmental heterogeneity. So as much as we can conserve different kinds of environments, much species we can keep alive. So it is a pattern for macrophytes, but can be found to other groups, maybe. We can try to understand this. So conservation efforts should consider then temporal and spatial dynamics, consider these studies. But also conservation efforts should consider local species related to peculiar environmental dynamics, like I'm trying to show you. Then we can not think in conservation, only think about the species, but also think about the environment and what are the species there. And for this reason, we try to fight some politicians' decisions, writing some papers about that, like this, that we published this year, in the beginning of the year. And we try to question why decision makers and politicians try to do laws without consult the specialists, the scientists. We have the knowledge and they have the power to decide. But why not use the knowledge, the scientific knowledge, to have a decision, how can I say, more smart than they thought. So it's one field of our works, and the other kind of studies we are doing are related to biological invasion and the global change in aquatic environments. I tried to perform some experiments related to this, acidification and global warming, and usually with macrophytes. We can see that, for example, with acidification, here you can see brown water, the acidified water, and here the clear water, and we can see the response of invasive species here. Here we have temperature, natural temperature, and here elevated temperature. So we can see that independent of the effect of temperature, the acidification could be more important depending on the invasive species we have. So here we have more land, we have more biomass for the invasive species compared to the natural waters. So with acidification of aquatic environments, we can have facilitation of invasions. And we can see here also that here we have the relationship with competitors. Another periphyton, some filamentous algae, and other macrophytes that we found seedlings on the bottom of the experiment. And we took everything we have there and tried to consider that as a competitors. And then we can see here that the biomass of competitors here are much higher than here. So here we have the natural waters, clear, normal temperature, and here elevated temperature and clear water. Here we have only brown water, acidified, and here acidified and also the effect of temperature. But we can see that the temperature is not enough to have an effect to reduce competition. But the acidification has an effect enough to increase the success of invasions and the reduction of competition. So it's one way that global change, like acidification of aquatic environments, could affect invasion and facilitate this kind of species. Another way is the relationship with eutrophication and also acidification. So we have first a condition. Here we have a scenario that a natural lake can become eutrophic, the increase of nutrient availability, phosphorus and nitrogen. In the second scenario, you can see here that we have CO2 in the atmosphere and also in water. But with increasing CO2 atmosphere, we also increase in CO2 in water. Because of course we have exchanges in the water interface, then we can have more CO2 in water if we have more CO2 in the atmosphere. So here we also have a nutrient availability, but not phosphorus and nitrogen, but carbon, another kind of nutrient. But for submerged macrophytes, carbon is also important. And for invasive species, this kind of nutrient is most important. So here we can see that from this scenario to this one, we have a submerged macrophyte decrease because turbidity increased and submerged plants has no light enough to survive. Although we have phosphorus and nitrogen. But in the second scenario, we can increase nutrient availability, carbon, for example, the most important to photosynthesis. And here we have light enough to grow. So here we have a special condition, a nutrient, light, and we can have an environment more susceptible to invasion. So we try to use this approach to evaluate how invasion could respond to these scenarios. And here we can see that the biomass, when we pass from the eutrophic scenario to oligotrophic scenario to eutrophic, then we have biomass reduction from the native and the invasive species. So submerged macrophyte in general respond negatively to eutrophication. But here we can see that in a similar way, native and invasive reduce the number of lateral branches produced during the experiment. So both native and invasive species respond similar to the effect of eutrophication. Even though we can see here that the invasive species has more lateral branches, and this can produce more individuals and increase propagule pressure, increase invasion. So it is a characteristic of the species. So we can see that it's a trait of invasiveness that benefit the invasive species. And also we can see here that if we acidify the water, then you can see that the effect of oligotrophic waters are similar here. So if you have a lake, oligotrophic lake, and acidify the water with CO2, then the result is similar. But if you have an eutrophic lake and acidify this lake, you can see that all the results increase here. All the results increase here. So if we have a combination of pollution that is common nowadays, and lake waters become rich in phosphorus and nitrogen day after day, and also we have an increase of CO2 in the atmosphere, then we can have this scenario, a facilitation of invasion to many submerged macrophytes in some lakes. We can see that it's like the effect of eutrophication is neutralized when you acidify the water with CO2. So it's a little bit strange, but it works. The species can grow effectively. So eutrophication and acidification affect invasion. Submerged macrophytes, submerged plants in general would be affected also, but we can see that global change may determine environmental susceptibility to invasion and may facilitate the invasion of some species of macrophytes. And these successful invasions may depend also on the species' ability to invade. So we have here a combination of what we call invasibility and invasiveness. The environmental characteristic that is changed, and also the species characteristic that is intrinsic of the species. So it's not a good combination, indeed. Another way, we are working to trying to evaluate these non-native species in the environment. So here we're trying to create an index that helps us to identify these impacted environments with non-native species. Here we use the fish species, and here we are applying we call MMI. So multimetric index is not MMA, but it's a similar way. Here we have the invasive, and here we have our biodiversity. May crash it here. So it's a similar impact we have. So that's the way we are trying to work with this approach. So we have here an evaluation of aquatic ecosystems integrity. Here is the map of our state. I think we are close to here, maybe. We analyzed 105 streams around our state, 19 with non-native species, and 86 only with native species. And we tried to create a model with fish community characteristics. So we tried to select some traits that could help us to understand the impacts of non-natives, or at least to identify what are the streams that we can have severe impacts on the natives. We consider that only the presence of invasive species can be a threat to the natives. So that's the way we select some streams to be characterized as impacted. So I'm sorry, this is really, really, really small, but I'll try to show you here. Here it's only to have an idea how we produce the model. So here we have all the streams in our data set, 105. We selected 19 impacted with presence of non-natives, 86 as we call the reference streams with no, with only the native species, fish native species. We pick up two groups. One we called calibration group, another validation group. To the calibration, we used 12 streams from the 19 invasive and 50 reference from the 86. And to the validation, we used 7 streams impacted from the 19 and 36 reference from the 86. So this is the first step to prepare the model. Then we used this data set selected here to calibration and randomly select 8 impacted and 8 reference, thousands of times. And then we produced a relationship between the variables we collected to prepare a model, a multimetric index, the first one. With this multimetric index, we applied this to those of validation to see if the 7 here can be identified as impacted by our model, and if the 36 here could be identified as reference to our model. And we proceed with this thousands of times. Then we found 6 models able to be used in this area. These are the models. Here the variables, the metrics we used. Percentage of detritivorous fish in the stream, the percentage of tolerant fish in the stream, percentage of benthic pelagic fish, so it's the habit that the fish is eating, for example. Fish that use the surface, most of the time these fish are eating on the surface, evenness of the fish community, and also the abundance of fish community. So these kind of metrics are simple to measure. You can just catch the fish and identify the species, know about the habits, and calculate the evenness and count the abundance. So with these simple metrics, we can use this multimetric index to see what are the impacted or not, considering the presence of a non-native species. Then, using these models, we can see that all the 6 models represent well what I'm talking to you. Here you can see this group is our group of reference streams. So the index generates a number from 0 to 1 that we have categories here: bad, quality, poor, moderate, good, very good. So most reference streams you used are classified as good, and most with the presence of non-native species are classified from moderate to bad condition. So independent of the model, we tried to use these 6 that we found. All those 6 fits well in what we have in nature here. So it was an attempt to show that simple variables may be useful to identify impacted environments when non-native species are present, and also trying to say that simple indices may be used and not complex only, because most of the index have variables that are difficult to measure in the field to get the variable, so it's a little bit complicated. Well, so here we found that invasion may promote the loss of ecological integrity because all the impacted environments we measured, we quantified the non-native species, we found bad quality or poor quality and so on. So maybe only the presence of the invasive macrophytes, in fact, the invasive fish may promote the loss of this ecological integrity. Okay, so again, conservation efforts should consider environmental characteristics, but also conservation efforts should consider species peculiarities. So, sorry about the joke. But species peculiarity is something that must be considered when we are talking about invasions, because invasive species has traits that is really different. They are really different from the natives. So we can't overlook these traits of invasive species. So we must consider these species peculiarities. So dispersion, reproduction, and other kinds of attributes that the invasive species has most depend on the intrinsic characteristics of the species, but also could be enhanced by the environmental characteristics. So these two aspects can't be left behind. So it's all. Thank you for listening. Hope nobody is sleeping. If you have some questions, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, questions?
Questions?
You mentioned like trying to keep everything as natural as possible. Once you have an invasive species present, it's not really in its natural state anymore, right? So what are some of the things that you can do to try to restore it back?
Yeah.
Like how do you get rid of these
species? we have projects of management, but unfortunately here in Brazil we don't have such kind of biomanipulation in lakes or in aquatic environments, but usually we can do that. In Europe we have many lakes that are biomanipulated, and we can remove the invasive species from the lake and try to get back the natural situation. Of course, we don't get back, it's impossible to keep in the natural condition, but we can biomanipulate the lake and maintain as natural as possible when removing this kind of species. But we should consider that this kind of management must take care with the how can I say, the evolution of the invasion, because if it is starting, then we can manage with success. But if it's not starting, then we don't have success. If you try to manage, we can have more problems. So it's hard to manage and remove the invasive. That's why we are trying always to say that the most important thing is not introduce, because remove is difficult. So, but it's possible in some place.
So, and kind of like with that too, you were talking a lot about like climate change, pollution, all that. I mean, that's real everywhere right now.
Yeah.
And with that, you said it's easier for the invasive species to take over. Are more species becoming invasive?
Yeah.
Like they're shifting, right?
Yeah.
It's a different, yeah.
Yeah, because for example, if you have a mountain, then we have some species that are living in the base of the mountain. Then if you go up, so the temperature is reducing. But if you have climate change, global warming, for example, then temperature, if you go up, temperature is reducing. So the species maybe can move, because the range of the species. Environmental characteristics is not selecting more the range of the species. So that's the way we are having species expanding the range of occurrence around the world. So, more questions?
More questions?
Professor?
I have a question related to that global climate change and carbon dioxide increasing the atmosphere.
Yeah.
You showed how that increases the carbon dioxide concentration in the water. Do you actually measure greenhouse gas emissions or consumptions by shallow lakes? Or how does that relate to your research?
Yeah, I didn't.
Oh.
Yeah, but in this experiment we tried to control. So we acidified with CO2. We inject CO2 in water, and using alkalinity, we fractionate the carbon and find like a surrogate of CO2 availability. But not in this experiment. But in other studies related to shallow lakes, other researchers found relationships and measure with, I don't remember the name. It's like an aquarium, but in the surface. And then we can capture the atmosphere CO2 and measure in the water and instantaneously compare, and then they get the result. Fancy technology. Right. And so in these kind of experiments, they found relationships with the increase in atmosphere and the water. So maybe not in the rates we expect, but how can I say? The carbon dioxide does not increase in water as increase in atmosphere. It's really different, but there is a relationship. Yeah.
More questions? I have one. I don't know if I lost something, but it's amazing in this MMA index.
Yeah.
Right? you got in that research, but I don't understand that difference. That index was based only on evenness and abundance. I don't know if I lost.
I'll back in the slide. Here. Yes. Yeah. We have more.
Metrics.
Yeah, more metrics. More metrics. But these metrics were selected by the model. Yeah. But we have all the others. Yeah. We have all other environmental, like substrate, turbidity, oxygen. But yeah, but the effect of the non-native species is not related to this kind of sediment or the percentage of dissolved oxygen, but the effect is on the biodiversity. So we have some attribute that, for example, if we introduce any species that is detritivorous, then the detritivores will decline. So the percentage change. So that's the relationship.
More questions?
Related to that, you validated your model, and again, maybe I got lost. Were you saying the presence of invasive fishes decreased the environmental
integrity,
the ecosystem health, or a decreased or compromised ecosystem increased in invasiveness?
Good question.
Good question. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We found that the presence of the non-native decreased the integrity in the index.
Actually,
but yeah, you can continue.
No, actually, the way I see is that the bad conditions proporciona or
promote
the occurrence of the non-native species, no?
Yeah, maybe, but most of our streams have, when you use only the physical-chemical variables, they are good. If you apply another index that consider only the physical-chemical condition, they are good in the index. But if you include the non-native, the biota, then you have the loss of integrity. That's the problem, because most of the index don't put together the non-native species, use only chemical or physical characteristics of the environment. So we lose the information of biodiversity.
Yeah. More questions? No? Thank you very much, Roger.
Welcome. Thank you.